Everybody, welcome. 1 second, we are getting live with the final camera as people are coming in to watch. All right, we are here with Dr. Nan Greer. What is your Twitter handle, Dr. Greer? I forgot to ask you.
Ooh, I think it's Nan Greer altogether. I'm not positive.
All right, that'll work. And Dr.Mordechai Kedar. And as people are coming in, we are about to start now. All right, everyone, thank you so much for being here. I am here, the only non-doctor in the room. The only non-doctor, which I'm very proud of. That's fine. I like to be surrounded by much smarter people than me. That's how you learn. Dr. Mordechai Kedar, expert on Islam and the Middle East, and Dr. Nan Greer, who have the privilege of meeting and get to know a little better and talking with, an expert on the documentation of Indigenous rights, how to document Indigenous rights. So that's what we're talking about. For people who are not familiar, we'll get into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of what this Indigenous rights topic is all about and why it is so important for the Jewish people and the land of Israel today. So first of all, welcome Dr. Greer, welcome Dr. Kedar. Thank you for being here.
Pleasure to be here.
So how can we help explain to people what are Indigenous rights? Like you talk to most people, they're like, oh, Native Indians. What are Indigenous rights, and why is that a topic that's important to the Jewish people?
Well, most recently, there's been an international recognition of Indigenous rights. In 2007, the world passed what's called the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. We call it the UN DRIP, and it sets out specific rights for Indigenous people, among them land, the right to self-determination, the right to autonomy and sovereignty, and some details as to how to document that.
Interesting. All right. Anything you want to add to that?
Well, when it comes to us, Jews, we already declared in the beginning, on the preamble of the Declaration of Independence from 1948, that in Eretz Israel, in the land of Israel, the Jewish people was born, grew up, and gave the Bible to mankind. So, definitely, we already declared that we are indigenous, but we didn't use the word indigenous, which today becomes part of the discourse in international arenas. And you can actually compare it to the human rights expression, which started to be the theme like 20 years ago. Until 20 years ago, nobody talked about this, human rights. But today, you cannot, say a sentence without including the human rights. Otherwise, you're out of the discourse. So this is what happens. And now, the indigenous rights start to be introduced into the international arena's discourse. And if we are not there, means that we are out of that.
Mm.
And this is why indigenous rights, we as Jews should be the first to claim that we are indigenous to the land of Israel, because according to everything which is documented in other nations' books, like the Greeks and the Romans, and archaeology, definitely speaks Hebrew. From this,
Nan and I were speaking earlier, and one thing I said is I'm also new to this use of terminology of indigenous. But for years, I've been using the statement that the Jewish people are the only people to be living in the same homeland, using the same language, and using our same religious tradition, cultural traditions as our ancestors 3,000 plus years ago. Never connecting that with the word indigenous.
That's a really interesting point, because having a distinct language, having a distinct religion and culture, and the desire to reproduce it, and the connection to the land are the primary focuses of the definition of indigenous.
Mm.
And other narratives of other ethnic groups in the area don't have distinct language, don't have distinct religion, and don't follow that characterization despite the false narrative that they do.
Wow. Okay. Did you want to add something?
Well, but the problem is that so far the state of Israel did not declare that we are indigenous.
What does that mean, the state of Israel has not declared that we're indigenous?
In the declaration, they stated some of what is the definition, but they didn't come out and say, we, the Jews of Israel, the Jewish nation, is indigenous to its homelands where their forefathers were coalescing on the land.
Okay. And that impacts politically how? Why is that important that it has yet to be declared by the state of Israel?
Well, I personally think that those who are in charge of joining all kinds of declarations in the world actually refuse to do this because they do not want Jews to be considered as indigenous in Judea and Samaria. Because those people might think that these areas, means Judea and Samaria, should be given to the Palestinians, to the Arabs, to establish their state. So those who are for a Palestinian state are actually against the declaration of Jews as indigenous to exactly the same land.
It's such a dangerous suggestion because it leads precedence to the possibility that colonists can claim lands of indigenous people and take it from them in a legal international setting.
Right.
So this is part of the claim, and this is why Israel needs to stand up and defend itself.
All right. Now, I don't know if you guys understand the impact of what Dr. Greer just said. So I'm going to try to bring it out a little more. In your documentation that I just had the opportunity and privilege to read, there's one concept that you just touched upon, where basically you said, if the indigenuity, I don't even know if that's the other, indigenuity of the Jewish people as the indigenous people of this land, of the land of Israel, is not accepted, and instead our land is given over or treated as if it belongs to another people, that is the most dangerous precedent to all indigenous peoples of the world. Can you expand upon that?
Yeah, it allows for the legal takeover of colonists of indigenous land. And it's a very difficult piece because not only do we value cultural diversity, but we also have a special emphasis on indigenous people taking care of the land above colonists. Indigenous people are proven time and time again to preserve their natural resources where others that are from other places don't tend to do so. For example, in Central America, we found that colonists were deforesting humid tropical forests that are special and protected, the lungs of the world, at an 18% rate, whereas indigenous people were reforesting and actually at a positive 1% rate. So they were taking care of the forest, whereas colonists were destroying it in mass. And
Wow.
this is what
And
we're
here,
finding around the
Same
world.
thing.
Here, what you see today, every day, the
Same.
burns, the fires around Gaza.
Right.
Who burns this place? Those who don't belong in that
Right.
place.
Someone brought up the analogy to King Solomon and the two babies and
Right.
the two mothers.
Right, the same thing.
Right? Who would burn your own land? No, you only burn it if it's not yours. If it's yours, you don't burn your land.
Right, and this is actually why the idea of indigenuity is so important to associate it with us Jews, as after all we came back to our forefathers' land after we prayed to this direction for 19 centuries.
Right.
Now there is no other precedent in the whole world that a group which was in exile for 19 centuries, dispersed all over the world, came back,
Right.
gathered, renewed its language, renewed its culture, renewed its independence and its connection to the land,
Right.
in all the aspects. So this is why I think that I'm not the only one to think that we Jews are the prototype of indigenous people.
Indeed, one of the stunning examples because they've acquired sovereignty. And this is something that all indigenous people aspire to.
Right.
And here you have a stunning example.
Right. No, I like to tell people that Israel is the most inspiring story of the 20th, 21st century for all of humanity, and especially for indigenous peoples. for indigenous societies because we are the only success story basically. And then so I want to go back to that point before about the importance of recognizing the Jewish people's in indigenous rights to our land, because what Dr. Greer is basically telling us is that anyone who says that they care about indigenous rights for any people around the world, they should be the first ones standing up and supporting the Jewish rights to our homeland as the Jewish people being indigenous, because by them supporting the Arabs as being indigenous instead of us, they are hurting the legal precedents for any other indigenous people around the world to hold on to their lands and not for colonializers not to be given to it instead of them. Am I correct on that point?
That's correct. I've also heard an extremely serious concern about the possibility of Jews losing their land and how devastating that would be to their survival. In effect, eliminating their ability to survive. So in this regard, Jews cannot lose their homeland, their indigenous ancestral land upon which their forefathers were living and bringing about an amazing culture that really has affected the whole entire world.
Unbelievable. Now you... Yes.
There is another very important point. Once we consider ourselves as indigenous and others as well, the terms of occupation actually disappear. Because how can an indigenous nation can be occupier on its own
land.
Soil?
You can't.
So this is one thing. Second thing, all kinds of weird, hallucinated decisions made by UNESCO, for example, about the belonging of Jerusalem and Hebron, actually are nullified. Because if we Jews are indigenous to both Hebron and Jerusalem, how can an organization politicized to its teeth decide that we are not?
You're also legally protected under international law that mandates that you are to be consulted in any kind of a declaration over your sacred sites. So you have what's called free, prior, informed consent. That is what is probably one of your most critical pieces of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, that mandates the international community to ask your permission about naming and protecting your sacred sites.
Okay, so this is going to get into the next question, because if I'm not mistaken, what Dr. Greer is hinting at right now is the importance of the Jewish people being recognized internationally as the indigenous people to our land, because that it impacts politically decisions on the international level. Correct?
Correct.
All right. So the question is, why now? Why is this issue of indigenous rights so important now? Why is it coming to the fore now?
One of the things that we see throughout the lands of Israel is a lot of non-governmental organizations working with populations, especially the Arab populations, to document their geographical areas as if they are indigenous territories. And they're coming into court with very little documentation, and they're trying to effect a change in the legal system here and also on the international level that they can benefit from. And it's very dangerous for people here in Israel, and it's very dangerous for people around the world.
Now, if I'm not mistaken, from what I learned, you developed this methodology
in conjunction with indigenous people in Central America.
Yes. And now here I'm sitting with a doctor who in conjunction developed this methodology, and based on your methodology, you understand and recognize the Jewish people as the indigenous people of this land, and here you're seeing your own methodology being used against the Jewish people as the indigenous people of the land. All right, so now we're going to go into the next thing. Your title, your expertise is this documentation of indigenous rights. What are you working on now to counter what you see those nonprofit organizations, non-governmental organizations trying to help the Arabs steal away our indigenous status from us?
There's a couple of things. For one, we're trying to convince the Israeli government to sign the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People while issuing a reservation or an amendment that suggests that once indigenous people reach sovereignty, that doesn't take away their indigeneity. They're still indigenous. So that's one key piece. Another piece is using the massive amount of evidence that has been collected and developed over centuries that can support that that declaration of indigeneity, and also the claim to the rights of their lands and protecting indigenous Jewish communities throughout all of Israel.
So I'm going to go back to your first point because I don't know if everybody understands. All right? You were basically saying that right now, according to international law or the international community, because the Jewish people are now sovereign in Israel, we are automatically not considered the indigenous population.
Yes, once you strive for and reach the goal of what indigenous people strive for, indeed sovereignty, the power and authority to rule themselves and their lands, then all of a sudden it's suggested in this regard that you lose it, your indigenous status, which is absurd, and it's an impossibility.
That is an absurdity to the nth degree on the international framework. Meaning, taking this logic, if Native Indian tribe X all of a sudden achieves sovereignty over their land, then according to the international community, they no longer would be considered an indigenous population.
Indeed, when we talk about the third world and the first world, we call indigenous areas fourth world. And the reason why we make reference to them in the fourth world is because they're considered nations in nations, nations under nations. But what this is something completely different. Now, the jargon has been twisted to be able to call them first world or first peoples nations, right? But in essence, the strata that we refer to them as is in the fourth world. And here you have an example where that absolutely does not apply. Israel is definitely a first world nation, and not only that, it's sovereign and it's indigenous.
Unbelievable. Okay, so what Professor Greer, together with Professor Kedar and others, are working on is to push the Israeli government to initialize this project to use the internationally recognized documentation process that Professor Greer herself helped develop, so that it can be brought to the international courts, international organizations, to prove the Jewish people's indigenous rights to our land. Which brings me to the next question is, Dr. Kedar, anyone not familiar with Dr. Kedar's solution, I wouldn't call it a peace solution, because understanding the Muslim world, there never will be true peace with the Muslim world and the Jewish people, but we will be able to live peacefully. That's how I define it, I think, somewhere along. Okay? What is this concept of indigenous rights? What's that connection to your solution that you're pushing, which is the 8 Emirates solution?
Well, actually, the indigenous issue is the basis. Why? Since Jews are indigenous to the land between the Jordan River and the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, since it's ours, now we can do with this whatever we like. We are not obliged to do anything if we don't like it. Means, if let's say Nablus, the city of Shechem, we can decide that we want to give this part of the land because it belongs to us. We can allow them build an emirate over this land because it's ours. It all depends on us and our consent. Then we can go to another group, to the Arikat tribe who live in Jericho, and tell them, hey guys, this is your place, this is where you live, you own it. By the way, indigenous issues do not have anything to do with ownership. It's a matter of sovereignty. And sovereignty is in one thing, and ownership something. I'm not about sovereignty. But ownership, if anyone, Arab or not Arab, owns a land, this is sacred. This is his. Period. Nobody is allowed to confiscate, or otherwise to this man. This is his land if it's registered legally. So, since they own those parts of the land in Jericho, for example, we can say, okay, guys, you can have an emirate in Jericho. These are your borders.
Can you define an emirate? What's an emirate? What are you referring to?
Emirate is a state, just like Dubai, just like Abu Dhabi, Qatar, Luxembourg, Andorra, San Marino, Monaco. This is what they call emirates. Countries which not necessarily have to be big, yet they are based on one group. And in the Middle East, a state which is based on one group is a successful state like the Emirates in the Gulf. While if you combine many groups together in one state, like tribes and ethnic groups and religious groups and sectarian groups, you get a mayhem, just like in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Sudan, all these atrocities. So this is why, if you establish those emirates on the basis of one group, as they are socially, you get a flourishing country, so a flourishing state, and very peaceful, just like the Gulf Emirates. So this is actually a solution which is based on the sociology of the Middle East on one side, and the fact that the land belongs to the Jews as indigenous people on the side. You don't kick out anyone, and you actually recognize the fact that they own the place because they bought it, and they are registered as the owners. Okay, have your own emirate, a state, which doesn't have to be big, and mind your own business, leave the others alone, and be very careful because we are around you, and we will not accept any shooting and any fire balloons or kites, or not to mention missiles, and take care of yourself. And if you need an electric transformer, we'll give it to you if you need, or whatever you need. If you have to go to abroad, sit with us and we'll agree about the arrangements of transportation, water supply, sewage, electricity, whatever you like. And we'll live next to each other peacefully. And this is the only thing which can survive in the Middle East. And this is actually based on the fact that we are indigenous to this country, therefore we are allowed to allow others to do whatever they like in the part which we will give them because we decide to give them this part. This is the whole thing.
One important piece in this is when we try to do it differently by creating a structure from the top down rather than from the territory up, we found a tremendous amount of corruption and
which exists today with the Palestinian Authority, in a sense.
So you're seeing some of the examples of what happens when you're creating...
You're seeing this in other places as well, not just here you're referring to.
Yes, this has been our experience in Central America when we tried developing these areas from the top down. It was nothing but corrupt, and when they went through a process with us collectively and developed it collectively and worked together, they developed it from the base up, and it was much more appropriate, much more according to history, and something that was based in their traditional structures of elders, clans, tribes, something that is more of their
that's really
nature
important
as a society.
Social substance.
Right. So I'm gonna reframe this. Mm-hmm. Basically, if I'm not mistaken, Dr. Greer said the following: anytime the actual sociological and indigenous issues are not dealt with and recognized, and instead it's the international community or outside world forces who try to impose a solution, then they don't work, and it turns into some corrupt structures, and it does not turn into a peaceful society. But when the actual sociological situation is recognized for the true situation it is, which includes recognizing who these true indigenous populations are, and then on that basis coming up with having the peoples themselves work out that deal that makes sense, then a peaceful solution can come about.
That's correct.
Okay.
And it's almost as if from the outside we think people are too stupid to know what to do. But in fact, it's the outsiders that are not recognizing that in the land itself is all the capacity to take care of what is needed, and it needs to be respected, and it needs to be encouraged from the ground.
Right. And the one missing piece that was hinted at, but we didn't discuss for anyone not familiar with Dr. Kedar's knowledge and research of the Middle East and Islam, and definitely go to his website to learn all about it, MordechaiKedar.com. Is the fact that when he's talking about the different tribes, and I'll let you talk about this, is there a Palestinian people, Dr. Kedar?
Look, just like there is no Iraqi people, or Syrian, or Sudanese, because they're all fragmented to tribes, to ethnic groups like Arabs and Kurds and Turkmens and others, religious groups like Muslims, Christians, Yazidis, Sabais, Mandays, Zoroastrians, Alawis, Druze, and others, or sectarian groups like Sunnah and Shia and so forth. They never made a nation with an awareness of unity. And this is actually what brought these countries like Iraq, Syria, and so forth to the swamp of blood, tears, and fire, as they are, unfortunately. The Gulf Emirates, on the contrary, are peaceful, are stable, are flourishing, are rich, not because of the oil. Iraq has a lot of oil, and it is a mayhem. Libya has a lot of oil, and this is a hell. While Dubai, almost without any oil and gas, is a heaven. This actually shows that it's not the oil which makes a difference. On the contrary, the stability, the fact that every state or emirate is homogeneous, means one tribe or one group which lives in peace with itself, doesn't mess with others, minds its own business, and invests in learning, in promoting the place, developing the village, and this is why they are peaceful. While others, when you are forced to live with others whom you view as enemies because they are different tribe or different religion or different ethnic group or different sect, you will spend your time and resources not to build yourself, but to destroy the others. And this is actually why these countries are atrocities, because people there, and governments as well, are spending their time and resources not to promote the country and to build, but to destroy
The other.
the enemy. And the enemy could be the citizens.
And how does this connect with the issue of the Palestinians?
The Palestinians are the same, because they are a tribal society. A girl from Hebron has almost no chance to get married to a boy from Nablus, because they are different culture, different language, different approach, different everything. Not to mention the people.
In different dialect. Same language, different dialects.
Different dialects. Of course, once you open your mouth, the people know exactly where you are from. And not to mention Gaza, which never was part of the Judea and Samaria, and this was part of Egypt until 1967. And the population of Gaza actually stems from Bedouin groups, while the Bedouin component in the Judea and Samaria is maybe 1% or maybe 2% at maximum. So there's different cultures, different approach, different mindset, different scale of priorities, different set of values, different everything. So to say that they are a nation while the Syrians and the Iraqis are not, this is very strange approach. This is the problem. In the Middle East, people live in frameworks of family, clan, extended family, all these things. And this is much more powerful than the state. The state is viewed as the enemy of them all. And this is why these states are atrocities or dictatorships, because otherwise nobody will accept them.
We just had Prince William visiting here, and I mean, we sort of touched upon this. And for Prince William, it was a whole political catastrophe, because here the British are calling the areas occupied Palestine, and talking about what you're referring to. The hell that the Middle East is in today is thanks to the colonial powers of Britain and France and the other international Western world, who artificially created these nation-states according to the Western world's understanding of nation-states, not taking into consideration the tribal structure and society of the Middle East. So they are at fault for the creation of what's going on today, in a sense.
Well, the problem is that these are nation-states without nations.
Without nations.
One of the key things about that is that it's removing the indigenous people's ability to self-determine who they are, and it also removes the ability for these tribal groups, clan groups, to be able to have control over their own future, and instead places some kind of a bureaucratic structure that's created by the outside that most people suggest and understand is never going to be sustainable.
All right, well, I want to thank both of you for your time, for your knowledge, for all the work you're doing. For anyone who still doesn't get it or what's going on here, we've been talking about the Jewish people as finally being defined as the indigenous people to the land of Israel. and according to Dr. Greer's methodology and knowledge, how important it is for all indigenous peoples around the world to understand and accept the Jewish people as the indigenous people to this land in order to protect their rights also in the future in the international courts of law and opinion. And the importance of all of us to accept, yes, start talking about it. The Jewish people are the indigenous people to the land of Israel. And once we accept that, we will be able to come to a peaceful solution, not necessarily to peace written on a piece of paper, but a peaceful solution from the bottom up.
Correct.
Any last points to give over?
Well, we are in connection with some groups in Canada, for example, Indigenous Canadians. So, yes, there is some kind of an echo to this activity within other Indigenous groups.
Wonderful.
I just encourage the people of the world to open their eyes, to not stick to discourses that have just been spoken of in their vicinity, and actually do the research that needs to be done to discover what is really the case on the ground.
And we should all call the Israeli government to hurry up and to declare or to join this declaration of the United Nations, Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People, the RIP.
Wonderful, and that's the initiative they're working on right now. And I'm just following the final point of following what Dr. Greer was just saying today. Everyone, do your research. Learn about the Middle East. Learn about the Arab-Muslim culture, because in today's discourse that you're accepted socially as if you say Israel is the occupiers and the Arabs are the indigenous. No. Folks, the Arabs started in Arabia. Arabia. They're the ones who conquered the Middle East. They're the ones who spread over and were the true colonializers and occupiers of the Middle East and Northern Africa. The true indigenous population of Israel is the Jewish people. So get up on the history, find your facts, because we find out that the truth is 180 degrees different than what the accepted narrative is. There's only one narrative, and that's the narrative of the truth. Choose the indigenous population. Thank you for your work, Dr. Greer, Dr. Kedar.
Thank you so much, Avi.
Best of luck. Shalom, everyone. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Share. This is critical information we have to get out there to the masses. Take care. Shalom from Jerusalem. You're still live, so be careful. We're still live, folks.